Last time we were talking about stuff, we were talking about Imperial Japan. We talked about how the United States, before World War I, they got in war with Spain, and that allowed them to take over some islands over here, as well as the Philippines. That brought us closer to Japan. And then during World War I, we had the Central Powers of Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire fighting against the Allies, which was Britain, France, United States, Russia, and Japan. Japan never brings any troops over to Europe to help out, but they do take over some islands that Germany owned in Asia, and they also ended up bringing some destroyers over to Europe as well to kind of help out with just kind of the seas and such, and just kind of controlling the waterways. So make a new bullet, and we're gonna write down World War I results. So bullet, World War I results. Okay, World War I results. Number one. So first thing that we talked about was Japan taking over islands of Germany. So we're gonna write down number one. Japan rewarded with islands formerly owned or formerly occupied by Germany. So number one, Japan rewarded with islands formerly occupied by Germany. So that's kind of the first thing. You know, Japan had control of these islands, and those islands used to be occupied by Germany. So they took over those islands in the Pacific Ocean away from the Germans. That gave them more islands. And issues between the Allies and Japan pretty much started to develop in the 1920s. Mainly has to do with Japan wanting to take over China, and the United States, Britain, and France as being like, no, you can't take over China. There was also a treaty in 1922 that Japan, Britain, and the United States signed called the 355 ratio, which I'll explain. But going to make it two. And on two line, we're going to write down 355 ratio, and I'll explain what that means. So the 355 ratio, what that means is that for every 3 Japanese warships that they had, the British and the Americans would have 5. So basically what the 355 ratio says is America and Britain have the exact same size navy. So their navies are exactly the same size. And then Japan is only allowed to have 3 ships to every 5 ships that America and the British have. All right, so this kept the Japanese Navy at 60% of the size of the American and British navies. All right, so that's what the 355 ratio is about. Now, the emperor in charge at this time period, that is Hirohito. He's the emperor during this time. So gotta make a 3 and write down Emperor Hirohito, 1926 to 1989. So Emperor Hirohito, he's the emperor of Japan from 1926 to 1989. And he's not so much in charge of Japan. There was more the military was in charge of Japan at the time period of Emperor Hirohito. But he is the emperor during the time period. So even though kind of the military was kind of running stuff, he is the emperor during the time. But he is kind of responsible for kind of encouraging wars and so forth that kind of happen between Japan and the rest of the world. So Japan, as I said, they wanted to take over China, you know, even in the 1920s and such. And the United States and Britain and France were like, no, you can't take over China. Eventually, Japan decides to break off those agreements that it had with Britain and with France, and they kind of end up going their own way. And eventually, they end up making an alliance with Germany. So they kind of break away from their alliance from Britain and the United States. They were kind of just annoyed that they wouldn't let them take over China. So they broke off their alliance with them, and then they'll eventually end up establishing an alliance with Germany. But Japan does eventually decide to invade China. And they invade China. The first part they invade is in 1931, and then they do a full-scale invasion in 1937. So make a 4. And 4, we're going to write down Japan launches an invasion of China in 1931 and full-scale invasion in 1937. So 4, Japan launches an invasion of China in 1931 and full-scale invasion in 1937. Now, the invasion of China that Japan engages with in 1931 that's just over the northern part of China, just this area up here called Manchuria. So in 1931, they just take that very northern part of Manchuria. So Manchuria is taken over by the Japanese in 1931. They then began a full-scale invasion of China in 1937, where they then kind of proceed to go down southwards and then try to take over all of China. But in 1931, they just take over the Manchuria area. And again, that Manchuria area is important because it has natural resources. So in Manchuria, important because it has natural resources. And we talked about before about how Japan doesn't have many natural resources since it's an island. So in 1931, when they take over Manchuria, that gives Japan or China, Japan more access to natural resources. And then they do a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. There we go. So this is 1933 when Japan takes over kind of north part of China. And again, that's kind of Manchuria area. So in 1933, Japan kind of had just taken down to this area here. It's going to be a bit weird, but China in this time period is actually involved in the Civil War. So when I'm saying they invaded China in 1931 and then in 1937, those are actually two different groups. So China was in the midst of a civil war. There was multiple groups fighting against each other. Japan just simply took out the group that was in the very north that was also along the Great Wall of China. Okay, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. What's this done with the Great Wall of China? You can say Great Wall of China is kind of not in very good shape at this current point in time in 1933. This is a Japanese tank in the streets of Shanghai. This is troops at Nanking, taking over Nanking. So this right here just kind of shows Imperial Japan and their expansion. So the places in brown are the places that Japan controls. So places in brown are places that Japan controls. And up to 1941. So up to 1941, these places in brown are places they control. So you kind of see how they've kind of been expanding. So originally kind of over here, and they kind of expanded out into all of these areas. So let's talk about potential war winners for Japan. Go ahead and make a bullet and write down potential war winners. So potential war winners. So bullet, potential war winners. There's a couple of potential war winners that the Japanese had. One of the first ones here was the Zero fighter plane was one of their potential war winners. It's a pretty fast and pretty maneuverable plane at the time period. And the reason why it's a very fast and very maneuverable plane is that you don't think of this, but airplanes do have armor. So they do have armor on them. The Zero doesn't really have armor on it. So that's why it's pretty fast, is because, well, it's missing the armor. So they reduced the weight of the plane so that way the plane was faster. I gotta make a 1, and we're gonna write down Zero fighter plane for number 1. So number 1, Zero fighter plane. And the Zero fighter plane, as I said, was very fast and very maneuverable. So for 2, we're gonna write down faster and more maneuverable. So 2, faster and more maneuverable. So at the beginning of the war in 1941, the American planes that we had a hard time dealing with the Zeros, but eventually when we start producing like the Hellcat, for example, that plane had a strong enough engine that it could compete with the Zeros. And then once we started getting better and better planes, as time went on, the Zeros became less and less effective because we constantly developed our planes to be better and better. And the Japanese, they never really kind of got beyond where the Zero was at in 1941. Okay. Number 3, 2 biggest battleships. So 3, 2 biggest battleships. So they also had kind of the two biggest battleships that had been developed at the time period. They had the Yamamoto, which is here in the picture. So this is the Yamamoto. So you kind of see how it's currently under construction. And then the other one they had was the Masashi. So the Yamamoto and the Masashis. You can kind of see them there in the pictures there. So Yamamoto and Masashi is the two biggest battleships ever. However, we find out during World War II that battleships aren't really as useful as we thought that they would be. We find out that aircraft carriers are actually way more effective and way more useful in war than what the battleships are. So we find out that the aircraft carriers, the ability to kind of launch a plane and have that plane kind of fly a large distance and then drop a bomb on another ship was much more useful than having the battleship try to fire on another ship. So this became aircraft carriers became way more useful. And the last thing that I had Japan was pretty good at is they were pretty good with jungle warfare. Jungles is not something that Americans are really particularly familiar with. So we're not really familiar with like jungle warfare or how that kind of works and so forth. Because we have forests and so forth around our areas, but no jungles in the United States. Japan was a bit more familiar with the jungle warfare, and they're pretty good at kind of defending them and such. So make a 4 and we write down jungle warfare. So they're a bit better kind of at that and kind of the attack and defense aspects of kind of jungle warfare. That were a lot of the islands in the Pacific were, much more jungly, they're warmer and such. Yeah, and once you have that written down for number 4, that is where we're going to stop at for today.